So now I would like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Gabe Allen. He is a science journalist who is about to graduate with his master's in journalism from the University of Colorado Boulder. His recent Pulitzer Center project covered efforts to keep whaling practices alive in the Arctic. Allen was also part of the Boulder-based grad student team awarded a Pulitzer Center grant for their reporting on a coal ash waste site. We also have Jackie Llanos, who recently graduated from the University of Richmond and is now working at the Florida Phoenix. Her reporting covered the lessons Puerto Rican journalists learned and are now practicing post-Hurricane Maria. Next is Katie Schilder-Battis, a Medill School of Journalism graduate and Chicago Reporter staff member. She covered rapid climate change in Mongolia for her Pulitzer Center project. And last but not least, we also have Mandile Mpofu joining us tonight. Mandile is a Bay State Banner reporter who recently received her master's in journalism from Boston University. She was also just yesterday named an SPJ Mark of Excellence regional finalist for her reporting on climate adaptation in Namibia. So like I said before, all of these panelists were part of our 2023 reporting fellowship class, and we are so happy that you could join us tonight for this panel. So to start, I think it would be great if we could all just go around and have you quickly summarize your projects for us. And Gabe, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Jazzy. It's awesome to be here. And so for my project, I traveled to Utqiagvik, Alaska last summer, which is the furthest north community in the United States, way up in the North Slope of Alaska. And I was interested in going there for a few reasons. One, it's a news desert, so there's really no local news that gets created there anymore after their news department of their radio station and their local newspaper shut down. And two, global warming is happening at an accelerated rate in the Arctic and especially in Utqiagvik. So it's sort of on the front lines of climate change. And then finally, what I was really interested in reporting on was this culture of subsistence hunting. Utqiagvik is a place where people still get most of their food from hunting animals and especially marine animals like whales. So this is an important resource that's being affected by climate change. Yeah, and one of my first interviews that I sat down for when I was up there was sitting at a round table at the wildlife management department of the local government up there. And I sat down with the people who worked there, which were, scientists, it was hydrologists and ecologists and veterinarians, but it was also, what they call indigenous ecological knowledge experts. So whalers, hunters, people from the community, and they're all sort of employed in this department that's under Iñupiat leadership. And so that got me interested in this idea of the intersection of Western science and indigenous ecological knowledge. And, what I found is in many places, this is being called for more and more, right? We have like specific policy directives from the federal government asking scientists to go out and do this work. But in many places, disconnects between the scientific community and indigenous communities are making it so there's barriers to doing this work well, and sometimes these projects fail. But in Utqiagvik, the community is the one hiring the scientists. It's a flip of who's working for who, and in that case, it works a lot better. So my story was really about this one example and what we might be able to learn from it. And yeah, as a side note, there's also examples in the same community of when this doesn't work as well. So my story includes both.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. So my project was about how journalists in Puerto Rico are adapting to covering hurricanes. And again, as Jesse said, the lessons they learned from Hurricane Maria. And I took this approach because, every year we're seeing more hurricanes that are even more intense and more devastating. And they're starting to shift to some areas that haven't experienced hurricanes before, such as the one in Otis in Mexico last year. And I, started thinking like, well, journalists can turn to be the journalists working in Puerto Rico to learn what it's like to work under those conditions. And What I found when I got to the island was that after Hurricane Maria and after subsequent hurricanes, and also because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of news outlets shuttered because they couldn't afford to repair their antennas and their equipment, or just because they were in financial ruin. There were a lot of layoffs. But what came out of that was a resurgence in nonprofit media outlets and a change in the ecosystem from like being more competitive to more collaborative. And, you know, journalists think of the industry as, you know, thriving in competition. But what I found is that these outlets are thriving in collaboration. They're helping each other out. If one is online only, another one will print its stories. And then I also found that more journalists and also other ecological, environmental activists are turning to solar power to spread the news. So I came across Casa Pueblo, and they are this nonprofit and they advocate for solar energy. And they were one of the few radio stations that could still operate through Maria because they were powered by the sun. And since then, they've gotten more satellite phones so that they can help people communicate outside of the island. And they've also turned their transmitter completely solar so that it doesn't go down when a storm hits and the power grid goes down.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thanks for passing it off, Jackie. So my project was exploring kind of the impact of climate change on culture in Mongolia. So for a little bit of background in terms of what's happening with climate change, there have been just severe weather patterns, which have kind of led to drought, as well as flooding and really severe storms in the winter as well, which have led to a mass migration towards the capital city, Ulaanbaatar. And something that I noticed when I was researching this was that there's a lot of coverage of how this migration towards the city has led to a lot of issues for people living in the outer areas. There wasn't so much coverage of the actual solutions projects that are being done to kind of combat these issues. So something that I wanted to really look into was first of all, alternative reasons why people were migrating towards cities, and kind of give a more nuanced perspective on what was leading people to go to Ulaanbaatar. But also I was interested in the solutions projects that were led by a lot of NGOs that were kind of working hand in hand to address issues like pollution, lack of infrastructure around the cities. So yeah, like Jackie's project, something that I learned from this was how collaborative these NGOs were, and how they do end up working to collect data and then come up with solutions together. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. So for my project, I traveled to Namibia, which is a country in Southern Africa on the West Coast, to investigate how livestock farmers were adapting to recurring droughts. So Namibia is the most arid country in Southern Africa. It has 2 deserts, and the indigenous people in the region where I traveled, called Kunene, have been rearing cattle for centuries. But because of the lack of rainfall, which has led to a lack of pasture, a lot of them have had their herds kind of decimated because the cows didn't have anything to eat. So the government stepped in 2016 to help by providing the farmers with goats, which are drought resistant. So I wanted to find out how effective the program was, how the farmers were combining traditional knowledge with modern science, similar to what Gabe talked about. And also Namibia is uniquely positioned because according to the data that I was reading, it's kind of where some countries are projected to be in the next 20 to 50 years. It's warming up at a rate much faster than a lot of countries. So it can be a case study for what will happen in Southern African countries that rely on agriculture if no action is taken. And I also ended up looking into how a lot of the farmers, instead of just rearing goats, are also relying on community gardens and crop farming, which is not a traditional way of sustenance, but that's kind of how they are trying to adapt.
Great, thank you. And I want to congratulate each of you on creating some really fantastic projects. And again, thank you for, giving us this opportunity to talk about how you went about producing them. So I do have a few questions to start before we open things up to our audience. But again, to our audience, don't forget to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So Mandile, we'll start with you. Can you just tell us how you found the story and why you decided to pursue it?
Yes, thanks, Jazzy. So I originally was going to report on the state of healthcare in Zimbabwe, which is my home country. But after I received the grant, the fellowship from the Pulitzer Center, the situation back home was not safe for me as a journalist. So I had to pivot, and I brainstormed with one of my professors here at Boston University, who is a climate journalist at the Boston Globe. And he kind of pushed me to look into climate change in Southern Africa. I knew I wanted to stay in the Southern African region because I think that's not an area that's covered very much. So I ended up doing some digging into the climatic conditions in Namibia and how people were being affected. And I came across a research paper from 2018, I believe, where a group of scientists had traveled to a village in northwestern Namibia and had found that a lot of farmers who rely on agriculture were not surviving because of the recurring droughts. There have been consistent droughts since 1980, but the droughts have kind of proliferated in recent years. So that's how I found my my project. And I ended up, I think during my pre-reporting phase, found out about this program called IREMA, which is Improving Range, Land and Ecosystem Management, which was the government program that had stepped in to provide farmers with goats. So they would give farmers 21 goats to help them kind of rebuild their herds because all their cows had died. And I investigated during my pre-reporting what that program was. And I kind of prepared in terms of doing research on all the documents that they had, the proposals that they had. So that's how I found my topic. It was kind of from this research paper and then doing more digging and finding this government program.
Thank you. That's really helpful, I think. And then kind of moving on and completely switching gears, Jackie, your story is about journalists who I think are usually more accustomed to, staying behind the scenes and doing the interviewing. So did you find it challenging to interview the people who are usually doing that kind of work?
So I was lucky that my mentor, provided by the Pulitzer Center, was a journalist or is a journalist working in Puerto Rico. So she was able to help me connect with some folks so that I wasn't just a completely strange person who was not even from the island coming in and asking them to talk about some pretty traumatic memories. So on that side, I think that's what made some things easier. And then with some of the journalists, like they just really wanted to talk about it. I did some of the interviews in groups of like the people who worked at a specific outlet. I met with like a few of them at once. And it really just was, I had one question and they just started just telling me everything that they had gone through and how it had changed their outlook on the industry in Puerto Rico. So I think that was helpful in that they were also bouncing ideas off of each other, and it was kind of like it kind of helped them also reflect on it, just because I feel like when you're a journalist covering a topic like that, like hurricanes and the devastation that comes with it, you don't really stop to think about how you're processing things. So I think it was helpful to some people.
Yeah, something that I'm really struck by with all of your projects is that they're pretty, solution oriented, or they give hope to people, I think. And, when we report on climate change and climate migration, I think we naturally tend to focus on some of the problems it presents and maybe more of the negative parts of that. But instead, like I said, all of your stories focus on solutions and how people are adapting all around the world. So Katie, actually, could you tell us how you decided to take this more solutions-oriented approach to your reporting in Mongolia?
Yeah, so kind of circling back to something that Mandile said about a place being kind of a case study. I kind of felt very similar about going to Mongolia. because it has such biodiversity and has climate issues that are reflected in a lot of other places around the world. And I kind of felt like when I recognized that there was this diversity of issues because of the diversity of climates, it kind of occurred to me that a lot of the solutions likely could be applied to other places too. So specific solutions were being created to address these issues. So yeah, it was very likely that they could be applicable in a more universal way too. So yeah, even issues that are very specific had strong parallels. So for example, like a lack of data on maps, that kind of is an issue that I've seen in a lot of other places being reported on too. So it sort of felt like by reporting on solutions, it was more likely that this could actually have a greater use, as opposed to just making people aware. It could also potentially trigger some kind of change as well.
Gabe, you also did something pretty similar with your project, focusing on some solutions and some hope, I think, while you're reporting on whaling practices in Alaska. So can you tell us, especially given your time, at UC Boulder Center for Environmental Journalism, I think this is especially interesting, but why do you think it's important to take a solutions-oriented approach to covering climate change?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the importance of just to get at like the importance of finding solutions that address adaptation and mitigation in general. I mean, even if we implemented the most progressive environmental policies we know of right now, we're still going to be dealing with climate change and the after effects of pollution for many years to come. So it's important to find ways to adapt and mitigate these things that are coming. And I think the role of journalism is to go boots on the ground and really like tell a story about, are these things working? And I think solutions journalism, it is about like elevating those positive stories of this is working really well. And it's also about going and looking into solutions that are maybe idealistic or maybe they're good faith solutions, but they don't work the way that we think they're going to. And as journalists, we can go in and tell a story that's not just about the niche sort of scientific perspective of does this thing work or does this thing not work, but it also brings in the social implications of a solution, and it brings in the political climate that might make a solution more possible or less possible. So I mean, I think for all of us, we hope to write a story that affects if not a specific policy change or activism or the way politicians think about these things, even just the way that people talk about these things. And we hope to sort of evolve the discussion toward something that reflects our reality a little bit more.
So my follow-up for you, also kind of expanding on this, is what is your number one tip for those who need to take a very scientific or technical concept like climate change, and then how do they make it accessible to their readers?
Oh man, just one tip is going to be tough, but okay, I think one really easy practical one is when you're reading, you're going to have to read scientific literature to report on this stuff, and just read the abstract, the intro, and the conclusions, and you can kind of skim the rest because 90% of the time, unless you're a specialist in the field, you're not going to be able to like understand methodology in a really nuanced way. And, if you're doing a story where you have to report specifically on methodology, maybe you think there's a conflict of interest that's creating bad faith science or something like that, then you're going to have to bring in a specialist to look at that anyways. So yeah, when you're reading scientific literature, just abstract, intro, and conclusion. And I guess the other thing that I'll say really quickly is that I think good stories have characters and motivations, and those are sort of like scientific writing by design is devoid of those things. So you have to go looking for those things in other places and just go out and talk to people who are doing the work and who are affected by the work.
Yeah, when you're speaking about, the scientific literature or technical literature and things like that that you have to prepare for, I'm actually thinking about Mandile's project, where you had to, kind of dig into this improving rangeland and ecosystem management project. So could you just tell us a little bit about how you were able to report on this legal issue and project and what kind of pre-reporting you needed to do?
Yeah, for sure. So it was a lot to wrap my head around, I will say. I think it even took me, I think up until I landed in Namibia to fully understand what was going on. But I was very fortunate because this program or this project, the people who were leading it had documented it very well, right from when it was first proposed to the time when I reported in Namibia. So it was proposed, I think, in 2016 and first enacted, I think, 2019. So every single year from 2019 to 2022, which is the year before I traveled to Namibia, they had these really detailed, comprehensive reports about everything in the project, which I was so fortunate to find. They detailed like some financial information, exactly which areas they were going to, why they were going to those areas, what kind of improvements needed to be made. And then as the years went on, they would update those documents to show what progress they had made. So I could kind of give the readers of my story kind of like a case by case of why this was working, what they were aiming for, and what they didn't end up doing. So that's a lot of what I did during my pre-reporting, was digging into those documents. There was no abstract or conclusion, unfortunately, because it was just like a report. So I did have to kind of read a lot of it. It was a lot to go through, but I think it was really helpful because once I was in Namibia, I was able to say, okay, this is what you said you were going to do. This is where you are. What are your next steps? What do the farmers need to know? And I think that drove a lot of my story. I also spoke with a Namibian scientist before I left for Namibia. He wasn't super familiar with IREMA, but he gave me a lot of good background information about other similar projects and about why this one might work. Some of the things that they were doing, for example, I mentioned that they were combining traditional knowledge with modern science or traditional practices. So the goats that IREMA was giving to farmers were a mix between indigenous goats because they knew the climate and could adapt to the droughts, and then Boer goats, which I think they were like from South Africa or something, but those were kind of beefier goats, so they could have the meat to eat from the goat. So yeah, it was just a lot of reading the reports and then talking to that one scientist is how I prepared.
It's great, thank you. And it's great to see all these questions coming into our Q&A part of the Zoom. So please keep your questions coming. I'm going to ask one more question for you, Jackie, actually, before we open it up to audience Q&A. But I am really interested in hearing more about how you decided what mediums you were going to publish in, because you did publish both an audio and a print clip of your project, right? And so how or why did you decide that these were the mediums you were going to use?
So I mean, those were the mediums that I had the most experience in already, so that obviously played into my decision to do that. But I think also just hearing the voices from the journalists themselves. I conducted all of the interviews in Spanish. So when I was writing my article, I had to translate some of the quotes. And, you know, Spanish is my first language anyway, so it wasn't as difficult. But, you know, when you're translating, you're still losing some of the authenticity in the quotes. So that's why I wanted to do the podcast, to let their voices really shine and actually, you know, say what they mean. And it did take a different angle. So when I did the podcast, it focused a lot more on that mental health aspect of how the journalists have processed what they went through in Maria and what tools they're taking moving forward. So yeah, I mean, it was mainly because of the language barrier, and I wanted their quotes to be able to be represented, you know, in their full, in the words that they use, because, you know, that's always what quotes are for.
Great. And so I'm going to start pulling from our audience questions. There's a lot coming in, which is very exciting, and I look forward to seeing more. But I think, Jackie, maybe you can answer this first question. What extent did you have contacts set up to speak with in your reporting location before you got there? I know that your advisor helped quite a bit, Vanessa, but can you just speak a little bit more on how you went about finding contacts before and once you got there?
Yeah, so with some of the contacts, I already had some of the outlets in mind that I wanted to talk to, and with Casa Pueblo, which I mentioned before, I had already read a book about how they were a beacon of light during Maria when when the whole electric grid had gone down. So I had previous knowledge, so I knew which like outlets and people I wanted to talk to, but again, it was Vanessa. She already knew a lot of the people because, you know, it's a small industry and even smaller in Puerto Rico. So she was able to help me get some of their contact info. And I did reach out to a lot of them. I did pre-interviews before I left to kind of see who was more open to sharing different things. And then, because I only spent 10 days in Puerto Rico, so and then I had to adapt to the schedules of the journalists, so I could only do interviews like between 9 to 5 with them. So I had to narrow down what I wanted to ask each person specifically before I left. And some of the locations I went to were a couple hours away from San Juan, which was where I stayed. So yeah, with some of the people I did pre-interviews, I think with most of them actually.
And so maybe this is completely different, but Katie, you traveled to the most sparsely populated country in the world and reported in, you know, migrant settlements. So maybe you can also answer this, just how you went about identifying sources and also gaining their trust as an outsider.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of similar, but a lot of pre-reporting happened before I actually set foot in Mongolia. But I think when I started kind of planning the project, it was around January or February. I didn't actually get there until July, so I had a lot of time to start contacting people. And something that I found to be really incredible and convenient about the sources that I was speaking with was that it felt like for every one person I spoke with, they referred me to like 3 or 4 others. So it really kind of felt like this network of people, especially in NGOs, but around Ulaanbaatar, and everyone seemed like if there was someone that I needed to speak with, they could easily create a meeting for us. And especially with people who were actually just living in these settlements, it was incredibly helpful to have people who could kind of, act as a liaison for me to do that.
And continuing on this thread that we're on, talking about, you know, who you're interviewing, I would say that all of you interviewed pretty vulnerable communities, right? And Mandile, I think you specifically mentioned in your project page, like the vulnerability of these small scale farmers. So how did you go about finding your sources and then also gaining confidence, especially in an area where maybe people have lost trust in the media?
So I was not able to do any pre-reporting, mostly because it was challenging to connect with anyone there because a lot of them don't have internet access. I was truly in the rural areas of Kunene. So I found my contacts, my advisor connected me with 2 tour guides in Kunene. And once I arrived, we would just like the first 2 days, we just drove around the areas where I wanted to report. And they spoke the language there. So they would just ask farmers, she's looking for someone to speak to. Do you want to take some time to speak with her? So that's how I found a lot of my contacts. We drove around a lot, just like finding people who had been helped by IREMA. We stopped by the local like town council who pointed us to like people's addresses so we could go to their farms or to their gardens and homes to see what was going on. And then in terms of building trust, I think connecting in terms of being African was a big thing. A lot of people were kind of standoffish at first because they thought I was American, which is what my guides were telling them, that she was coming from America. But once I told them I'm actually Zimbabwean, we're neighbors, that kind of like loosened them up a little bit, and they had a lot more trust in me. I think a lot of it was also letting them lead the story, or kind of guide the story rather. So if I had any preconceptions about where I thought the story was going to go and someone took it in a completely different direction, I would trust them and never say, well, this is what I read, so why isn't it like this? So always trusting that they know their situation. I wouldn't say they had lost trust in the media. I think many of them felt hopeful that I was present, which did cause some issues in terms of some expectations of how the role that I would play in assisting them, which is a whole other thing. But yeah, that was in terms of reporting. And then in terms of writing, I think it was really important for me to not just talk about this group of farmers and this government project. It was important for me to like paint portraits of the people that I was speaking to, what they do on a daily basis, the things they wear, the way that they see the world, like the plants they interact with, what their traditional dress is, because they're so much more than, you know, just the subjects of my story and just the victims of climate change. So I think that was really important. And that's something that a lot of journalists I'd spoken to had told me or advised me to do.
That's a great tip, to just trust your sources, or trust that they know what they're talking about. So you all had very like wildly different, I think, experiences compared to your pre-reporting, and then once you got there and started doing the actual reporting. And Gabe, we have a question here for you about how you avoided parachute journalism. Can you tell us just some of the things that were at the forefront of your mind when you were reporting in a community that you're not super familiar with?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in a sense, my project was parachute journalism, in that I'm an outsider coming in and telling a story about a community that I didn't grow up in, for an audience of people that mostly also didn't grow up there. And I guess there's a couple things to address there. I think one is that I think there's still some value to bringing in a story to a different audience that might not hear that perspective in that way. Here domestically, I think we can learn a lot from what's going on up in Utqiagvik, and I don't think the story is going to get told another way because it is a news desert up there. But then, as far as you don't want to feel extractive when you're going to a community like that, and so my approach was to go figure out the people that were excited to talk with me and wanted to make a connection with me, and build sources through there. And then there were some people that didn't want to talk to me. You know, there's been a legacy of bad faith journalists coming on and sort of vilifying the practice of whaling. So some people didn't want to talk to me, and that was okay too. So yeah, I think I was just responsive to how people reacted to me being up there, and I think a lot of folks were really receptive to me wanting to share this story with a broader audience. And I think one thing too that's important to note about Utqiagvik is, it is a vulnerable population in a lot of ways. There's the legacy of being like an indigenous group in the U.S. and all of the history that comes with that. And they're on the front lines of climate change, but they're also very, very privileged. This is the community that is very wealthy from oil and gas money, because of the mineral wealth of the North Slope of Alaska. And so they have some unique power to approach things like working with scientists in a different way that other indigenous communities might not be able to. So I think it's important I think it took me being there to really realize that and realize this isn't just a vulnerable community. That's not their whole story. They actually have a lot of power, and that's one of the things that we can learn from.
That's great. Katie, you published your story in The Diplomat. I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about the pitching process and what that looked like for you.
Yeah, so for the pitching process for this project, it was pretty long and it definitely involved a lot of kind of false starts. But there were a lot of outlets that I was really interested in working with, and I'm still really interested in that. But kind of as with like the process of pitching any story, it kind of feels like even if you are really excited about your project and you're really trying to sell it, the reality is like it won't always be a good fit. But seeking out a publication that I felt published similar type of stories and was interested in publishing solutions-based reporting, especially in terms of like this area of the world, it seemed like a pretty good fit. So I reached out to an editor, and yeah, we ended up just kind of talking about the project. I had already completed most of it, and then yeah, I was really excited to see it on their site.
Yes, very, very exciting. And it's also on the Pulitzer Center website too, so everyone should go read it. But Gabe, I think this might be a question for you because you did work with scientists directly. We have a question about if you could give a tip to scientists on how they can effectively connect with writers and journalists, what would you say is key to an effective pitch, or maybe where should they be at for you to find them?
Yeah, I guess just to build off what I was saying earlier, good stories are built off of characters and motivations. So, if you want to get your research listened to, if it's something that you're pitching to the media, it's probably really interesting. And you might actually have a good idea of how to communicate, like what's interesting about it. But the way to sort of elevate that to the next level where a journalist sees it and they're like, I have to write about that, is talk about people and their motivations that drove this science, whether it's, the need for the science in the first place, or your motivations for doing it, your own personal motivations. If you can insert some people and motivations into your pitch, as well as what's interesting about the science itself, it goes a long way.
We have another question, and this is about if any of you want to comment on how reporting these stories has affected you personally. And, many of you went and reported almost a year ago, right? So if you just want to tell us a little bit about what you've learned since then or how it's affected you, that would be great.
I can address this a little bit. So, right before I was supposed to go on my reporting trip, there was a hurricane headed my way here in North Florida. And I grew up in Virginia. I had never encountered the possibility of a hurricane. And I was so scared because, I started living alone after graduating. And my mentor with the Pulitzer Center, and who also, as a journalist in Puerto Rico, she was helping me feel better about it. And it ended up not even really coming directly through my city. But it just made me realize before even going there, just like I can't imagine having to work under those really stressful circumstances. And I would say going after, I've really try to like still pay attention to the work that the outlets I talk to are producing and the journalists are producing. So it inspires me what they do, especially in the nonprofit, the new nonprofit outlets that are popping up are the ones that have been there and serve as inspiration for the people who are starting these nonprofit ventures on their own. So I recently saw that the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico, CPI, they did a festival with where they had workshops for other journalists to report in climate change and heat waves, because that's another problem that Puerto Rico is facing and a lot of the world is facing. So I guess that's how it affected me personally, just like wanting to be more in tune into what's going on in Puerto Rico and what journalism is coming out of Puerto Rico, because another problem with or not a problem, but like another thing that happens is when there's a hurricane, all eyes go to Puerto Rico, but after that, there's not a lot of coverage from the mainland US. So I think it's important to read what the journalists there are producing.
Jackie, I have another question for you from the chat about a comment you made about collaborative journalism versus competitive journalism. So what does that end up looking like? And are there any profit sharing or innovative business models emerging?
So what that looked like from what I talked about it with other journalists, they're obviously doing nonprofits, so trying to get donations from the public and from other organizations, and that's also happening a lot in others in states here in the US. But it also looks different based on the journalists. So some journalists that were working with a specific news nonprofit news outlet were also helping edit a newspaper for a smaller outlet. So it was also just that kind of collaboration, or they were also trying to open their own outlets, which I feel like wouldn't be possible, working in the industry here in the States, which is like you can't really, unless you're a freelancer, you can't really move around from outlet or help each other or like feed stories into another outlet as easily. And I think it also looked like a lot of veteran journalists coming back and starting their own outlets as well. So there was a lot of innovation coming from some people with a lot of experience who had mostly worked on print journalism.
Thank you. So another question from someone who is just getting started as an environment and agriculture reporter. What tips do you have for doing good reporting on this beat? This is something I think I'd be interested in hearing all of you answer. So maybe we'll start with Gabe and work our way through.
Man, I think my biggest tip is just like follow your curiosity, like figure out what you're really excited to learn about, and that'll just elevate your reporting so much, because you're just going to nerd out about it and find the most interesting little stories on your beat. Just figure out what you're passionate about and follow your curiosity. Trust your curiosity.
I'm not really on the environmental beat. I'm more on the health beat in my, full-time job. But I think it's also, and I'm also like health policy. So I look at things from like a political angle. So I tend to look at what is the government trying to do? What are they trying to address? And what are they not trying to address is also important. So just listening to the people who maybe coming to committee hearings, that's also like I guess more of a political answer, but that's where I get most of my ideas from. It's just what is changing, what change are politicians trying to make, and what change are they kind of like, what comments are they kind of ignoring, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is also not really my beat, and I feel like climate reporting is a little bit outside of my normal comfort zone, but I do think there were some really strong parallels with a lot of what I do work on normally, which is a range of social justice oriented topics. But I think that when I was making this project, something that I kept kind of coming back to is like, what is the outcome that I want and what is the impact that I would like this project to make? And I feel like that's kind of where the project kind of started off as this reporting on a bunch of problems and transformed into a very different type of reporting that I felt was a lot more interested in showcasing nonprofits and what people are doing and how people are really behaving as activists and innovators.
So it's not my beat either. But I will say, to answer the question about how this project changed me, I feel like it opened my eyes more to the possibilities of climate reporting. And I never considered being a climate reporter, but it's something that I've grown really interested in, especially as Zimbabwe, my home country, faces droughts similar to what Namibia is facing. So actually, at my full-time job, I recently pursued a story about how community gardens in Boston's environmental justice neighborhoods, which are low income, mostly minority inhabited, are adapting to the effects of climate change. And I think the thing that I learned from my Pulitzer Center project was to think about why people should care about how people are being affected. In the case of Namibia, it was because it wasn't just that, the animals were dying, the livestock was dying, people were going hungry, we're not eating for days on end. That's a real threat that a lot of countries can face. On a more kind of philosophical level, climate change was contributing to the loss of a centuries-old tradition. These people have been rearing cattle since the 1800s, I believe. So that's something that's really tangible to a lot of them, not being able to engage with the earth the same way that they would. So thinking about what could be lost as you approach your reporting into climate change. And in the story I did on community gardens here in Boston, the thing that was lost was that people were losing gathering spaces. A lot of these community gardens are some of the only third places where senior citizens can engage in community. One community garden, for example, was growing a plant that is used in Haitian cuisine because Boston has a large Haitian population. And that's not a crop that's found really easily in Boston. So you're also losing this access to your home country if climate change continues to affect community gardens. So I would say think about the why and think about what would be lost if in the worst case scenario.
Those are all great tips. Thank you, guys. And, since a few of you mentioned that this isn't your regular beat, I am really curious to hear what you are working on and maybe if you have one final takeaway for the audience. Mandile, I think we can start with you and work backwards this time.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about that project, which I just finished, but yeah, investigating the effects of climate change in Boston's environmental justice communities. I'm interested in how low tree coverage in those areas affect how people can engage in community during the summertime, because you can really feel it in Boston specifically, in a lot of cities really, when you travel into neighborhoods that are pure concrete, the kind of effect that the heat has. So that's something that I'm looking forward to investigating. And then one final takeaway kind of goes off of what Gabe mentioned earlier about when you're reporting on a community that is labeled vulnerable, not necessarily being attached to that label. So one of the scientists I had spoken to who had done anthropological work in the region I traveled to, when I mentioned to him, what are some of the issues that this vulnerable population is facing, he kind of stopped me and said, well, I wouldn't necessarily call them vulnerable because they have been adapting to droughts long before it became something that was talked about. They would dig in the ground for food, for water. They would use the leaves to kind of predict the weather, look at the trees to predict the weather. So they have a lot more knowledge than we kind of give them credit for. And a lot of these communities are not the ones who are contributing to climate change in the first place. So to call them solely vulnerable is not necessarily accurate. So that's just something I would consider if you are traveling to or reporting on a community that has been labeled vulnerable.
I'm going to start with my takeaway and then move on to what I'm currently doing, because I feel like that's such a good segue into what I kind of got from this project, which is that I felt like flexibility in my reporting was so important because I came into the project with a similar kind of, I think for me, kind of misunderstanding that I had gotten from my background research. And I kind of thought that I knew what was happening and what the problem was and what kind of the situation was. And then once I started speaking with sources, and one of them kind of directly said, like, reporting has missed so much of what's actually happening here. Just kind of the lesson for me of like, be forward and just ask sources directly, like, what do you think previous reporting has missed? And what do you think you would want someone to get right this time? That was like a really important takeaway for me. And then for what I'm currently working on, my normal beat is kind of criminal justice reform oriented. And it's a lot more local. So it's Illinois prisons mostly, and policies that are implemented in prisons and also jails around Chicago.
And I'll also do the same as Katie. So I think one of my takeaways is that just to remain hopeful as a journalist in the industry. My short career has been spent working with nonprofit and public outlets. So I had already kind of circumvented the legacy established big media corporations. The reason I did that was because I felt that's where the future of journalism was, in nonprofits and public media. What I really took away from my project is that, yes, there were a lot of layoffs after Hurricane Maria, and yes, a lot of outlets had to shut down, but it also paved the way for a lot of these new outlets that don't have the baggage of some of the and some of the criticism that legacy journalism outlets face. So I think it's important to know that the industry is not dying completely, and that there is valuable work coming out of nonprofits and public media, and to also not only rely on donations and donors, but a lot of some of these nonprofits that I talked to, they're also doing programming, and they're also doing contests and things like that to raise funds. And then one of the most impactful quotes that I was able to get from one of my interviews that I did with the director of Casa Pueblo. He was critical of the media because he said, you guys know that the electric grid in Puerto Rico is not working. So that's not really an excuse for you to not invest in solar energy and other ways and other renewable energy that is going to allow you to work through hurricanes that knock down the electric grid. And as to what I'm doing now, I cover, again, health policy in Florida. So I'm doing a lot about the Medicaid unwinding process, if anyone is interested in that. Yeah, I mean, I do think there's an intersection in climate and health. Obviously, the climate gets worse, and with the heat waves that we've been experiencing in Florida too, that affects people's health.
Yeah, I can do things in the same order too. I think my biggest takeaway is really, I guess, for scientists and funders of research. And I think it's that, what I found was that economic power created the ability for this community to have agency and do effective work. And so, if you're writing a grant or funding a grant, that's aspiring to do collaborative work with any community, not just indigenous communities. Think about just writing that community into the grant, giving them a good chunk of the money, if not most of it, because that's going to change. Yeah, that's going to change the dynamic in a way that might be unexpected and positive. And yeah, as far as what I'm working on, I actually just found out a couple days ago that a feature story stemming from this project is going to get published with Mongabay, so keep your eyes out for that. And then I'm approaching the end of a couple other big projects that I've been working on in grad school. One is coming out in the Colorado Sun about how to prevent the next honeybee pandemic is the tentative title. And then I have a story coming out in WyoFile called the University of Wyoming's Tribal Trust Fund. So yeah, keep your eyes out for those stories. And I just created a website, so if you want to check them out, you can go there and I'll try and post them. It's gabeallenmedia.com. Yeah, little shameless plug at the end here, but yeah, thanks for letting me join in on this panel. It was great to see some of my cohort here and hear their stories too.
All right. Thank you all so much. That is all the time we have for questions today. But I'd like to thank you all again, one last time, for joining us tonight and sharing your experiences with our audience.